For most of us, certainly for me, then what was first interesting about jazz chords was how they sounded different and had a lot of beautiful colors. Something else from what you're most likely already playing. But if you just learn complicated chords like that, then you find yourself trying to fit in a D7 flat 9 flat 5 in Wonderwall. And the only thing Liam says is,
well, my ears are in pain.
So instead of learning the chords as these isolated grips, then it's probably better to have some sort of system that can help you put them together in songs. But here you also have to be very careful that you don't fall into another trap. As soon as people talk about systems with chords, it usually becomes a great mass of inversions, variations, and string sets. And while those are good to know, that's not where you want to start, because you should not only be playing technical exercises. You need to focus on some chords that you can play music with. And as you'll see, something that you can improvise with, because improvisation is a huge part of jazz, also when you're playing chords. Instead, a great place to start is an approach which is closely connected to how you already think about chords, and also a great way to connect different types of chords, because nobody plays chords thinking in specific types of voicings. And in the end, you need to get it all to work together when you're comping. Usually when you're taught chords on guitar, then you're taught to think of them as grips, and you navigate the neck from the 6th and the 5th string where you play the root of the chord. So you have two main versions of each chord, one with the root on the 6th string and another one with the root on the 5th string. When you're starting with jazz chords, then you can build on that, even if you later stop playing the root or even relying on it at all. But we'll get to that. Let's take this into jazz. There's more to jazz music than just a type of chords. We also have some very common progressions that you want to know. The most important one is probably the 2-5-1. A 2-5-1 in C major is D minor 7, G7 to C major 7. And if you play that starting with a D minor 7 chord with the root on the 6th string, then you get this. And of course you can also play that where you're starting with a D minor 7 chord with the root on the 5th string. As you can see, then these chords are pretty easy to play, and it's a great way to play 7th chords where you have the root and then you have the important chord tones, the 3rd and the 7th, on the two middle strings. Voicings like these are called shell-voicings because it's the important shell that gives you the basic sound of the chord with the root, 3rd and 7th. But since it's just the shell, you can hear that it's also possible to add something to them. And keep in mind that you are not yet using the top strings. With these 3-note chords, you can already play songs. Check out how this sounds, but notice that there's actually more going on than just playing the chords. As you can see, then I'm working with the chords as having two parts. So we have a bass part and a chord part. This also works great if you want to use them for playing a bossa nova groove, like this famous song. But as I mentioned, you can of course also add more color to these chord voicings. So let's get into that. The first step was to split the voicing in a bass note and a chord, but there are a lot of other things that you can do. The first one is to use the two top strings to add some color and melody. If we start with the basic 2-5-1, then you can add some extra notes to make it a bit more exciting, like this chromatic melody. I'll talk about finding those extra notes in a bit, but first, since I'm only using the B string in this example, let's also check out an example where I'm using the E string as well. So we have two extra notes, which gives you something like this. When you look at these diagrams, then hopefully you can still see the original shell voicing in these chords. And I'll get to the melody, but first let's just talk a little bit about exploring what notes you can actually add to them. Now really, this is about figuring out what notes fit the chord, and usually also what notes are in the key. An easy one to start with is this D minor 7 chord. Since the progression is in C major, then that's also the scale that you want to use and listen to check out what notes might work. And here there are actually quite a lot of options because they all work. You have the basic voicing. You can add the root, the 9th, a high 3rd, the 11th, the 5th, and they all sound great. This is really just coming out of that basic shell voicing, and it's much more flexible to think of them as variations of that chord instead of having to learn 6 unrelated different grips. That's the kind of thing that you want to sit down and explore, just taking a single chord and grabbing a cup of coffee to figure out what works. And then you think about what sounds good, what is playable, can I use it in a chord progression or a song? And you want to take all of these things into consideration so that you have a practical vocabulary of chords that fit together. With all these notes available, then you can probably hear that we have room for some melody as well. Let's explore that. Here you have some of the chords from the previous example on the D minor 7 chord, and a few variations on the G7, plus a C major 7 where I've added a 9th. Notice that sometimes I just play the chord and move the melody without a chord, similar to splitting it into chord and bass note. I think that creates movement and variation and also makes it a lot less heavy. And you can create some beautiful things with that. Check out how this uses both melody and bass notes, not just chords all the time. Let's open this up a bit more by throwing away the root and playing rootless voicings, where you can also see how this is starting to connect to drop 2 and triad voicings. The first way to use rootless voicings is about making some things easier to play and just being more flexible. If you have the basic shell voicing and then you start adding notes, then leaving out the roots would give you something like this. But you want to think of it as if the root is still there. And not playing the root all the time makes it easier to play some of the other variations so that you can do something like this. Maybe this is a bit on the busy side for comping, but then it certainly also shows you just how much you can do with this. And also how it's already getting you into chord solo territory, which is probably a skill that you also want to develop. Again, I'm still really thinking of these chords just as variations of those basic shell voicings that I played in the beginning, not a lot of different unrelated grips. And that makes this a lot easier to get to make sense. It's like having a harmonized scale for each of the chords. And it is the melody and how the original chords fit together that makes it all work. And like this, you don't even need to play the bass, especially not if you're playing in a band with a bass player. Then you only use the bass note as a reference, a part of your fretboard overview, without ever having to play it. And playing like this will open up for even more interesting voice leading tricks, like these chromatic inner voices. Exploring all these things with your chords just coming from the basic shell voicings will also be incredibly useful for learning another important skill, chord melody playing. If you want to see how shell voicings fit into this, then check out this video that goes over what you need to do to create your own chord melody arrangements, just like Joe Pass and Barney Kessel.